Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into the muddy boots and battered helmets of medieval soldiers to find out what battles were really like. This is not the polished stories told in ballads, but the grim mornings where men stood shoulder to shoulder in soaked fields, armor chafing, hands shaking around splintered spears. Most of them didn't even know who the enemy truly was, only that they'd been told to hold the line, face forward, and swing their swords when the drum began to beat. So, before you get cozy under that warm blanket, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if what I do here genuinely helps you wind down at night. And hey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? There's something oddly soothing about knowing there are others awake with us, wandering through history together. Now, dim the lights. Light a candle if you've got one. Or just let the soft glow of your screen flicker like a hearth on a calm night. Maybe let a soft hum play in the background, steady and low. Close your eyes gently and let the weight of today melt away. In the early Middle Ages, there were no professional armies waiting in neat rows for orders. There were farmers with axes, noblemen with grudges, and horses that cost more than most houses. War was personal, and it started close to home. Sometimes, all it took was a broken fence. Two neighbors, both landowners, arguing over a strip of soil between their fields. One hires a few rough men to settle it. The other retaliates. Before long, they've both called on cousins, brothers-in-law, and neighboring lords. Bows are strung. Swords are unsheathed. And what began as a property dispute becomes a private war. But these weren't just about land. Feuds ran deep. If your grandfather was wronged, you inherited the right to make it right. And making it right often meant taking up arms. Revenge wasn't a crime. It was a duty. A man who ignored an old insult was thought weak. A family that let go of a past offense might lose its honor. So swords came out for slights that were decades old, and blood was paid for blood. In noble courts, marriage could start wars as easily as love could start poetry. If two families claimed the same inheritance, or if a wedding alliance collapsed, what followed was rarely a quiet letter of complaint. Armies were raised. Castles were besieged. Not over politics, but over family drama. One royal cousin might believe he had the better claim to a crown. The other might disagree, and 100,000 men would march because of it. But not every war was petty. Some were holy. In the 11th and 12th centuries, crusades swept across Europe. Preachers thundered from pulpits. Knights sewed crosses onto their cloaks. And entire towns emptied as men set off to fight in lands they'd never seen. Why? Because they believed it was sacred work. That fighting in God's name could wash away sins. That death on the battlefield might lead straight to heaven. But faith was complicated. Religion didn't just drive war against outsiders. It shaped conflict within kingdoms, too. A heretic down the road, a village that practiced Christianity a little differently, that was enough to spark violence. Kings and popes alike used the language of faith to justify conquest. Armies marched not just for land, but to correct others' beliefs. Of course, there was another reason for war, a quieter one, a colder one: money. War was expensive, yes, but it could also make you rich. Conquering a neighboring lord meant taking his land, his livestock, his gold. and sometimes even his towns. You could reward your allies with stolen fields. You could tax the newly conquered peasants. You could sell prisoners for ransom. For ambitious nobles, war was less a burden and more a business plan. Mercenaries knew this better than anyone. These weren't patriotic soldiers. They were professionals, men who fought for whoever paid best. When times were good, they were hired swords. When no one paid them, they simply robbed the countryside. War kept their coin purses full, and their blades sharp. Even peasants, those often forced into service, sometimes found strange comfort in war. Yes, it was terrifying, but it was also a change, a break from farm work, a strange kind of purpose, and in some rare cases, a path to reward or even freedom. A field hand who proved brave in battle might be given land. A farmer who saved a lord's life might be made a freeman. The chances were slim, but in a hard world, slim chances still mattered. And yet, despite all this, war wasn't constant. Medieval people weren't always fighting. Many years passed quietly, with only small raids or local skirmishes. But the threat was always there, like a storm waiting on the horizon. When kings grew old, borders blurred. When harvests failed, tension grew. When pride outpaced patience, swords were drawn. Because at the heart of it all, war in the Middle Ages was human, messy, emotional, not driven by numbers on a map, but by hurt feelings, holy visions, hungry mouths, and heated words. It wasn't always glorious. More often, it was confusing, loud, cold, frightening. Most of those who fought didn't understand the larger reasons. They followed their lord, their priest, their father. They swung a blade, not for politics, but because they had no choice. And when the battle ended, the reasons didn't always matter. Whether you fought for honor, for God, or for greed, the ground soaked up blood just the same. The trumpets blared, the banners flapped, and the armored men lined up beneath the morning sun. But behind all the pageantry and shouting, war was not only bloody, it was expensive, not just in lives, in silver, in oats, in linen, in the quiet misery of coin counted and spent far from the battlefield. Let's begin with horses. A good war horse in medieval Europe was not a creature you simply picked up in a village. A destrier, one of the powerful stallions bred for war, could cost more than a year's wages for a minor knight. These animals needed training, careful feeding, grooms to brush and calm them, and smiths to shoe them. They were armored too, with metal coverings that had to be hammered, fitted, and fastened with leather. If the horse fell in battle, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was a financial collapse. Then there was armor. Chainmail took hundreds of hours to make. Every link had to be riveted by hand. Plate armor, later in the Middle Ages, required blacksmiths with great skill and a buyer with deep pockets. One suit could cost as much as a small house. Even foot soldiers needed something. A helmet, a padded gambeson, maybe a shield with a painted emblem. These were not cheap to make, and they didn't last long under heavy use. Weapons dulled, shields splintered, and every dent and crack had to be repaired before the next campaign. But war was not just men and horses and metal. It was food. Feeding an army of 10,000 men meant baking thousands of loaves, brewing barrels of ale, butchering animals by the dozen. Soldiers burned calories faster than a forge eats coal. You needed salted pork that wouldn't spoil, dried peas for the pot, bread that didn't crumble to dust after a few days on the march, and someone had to carry it all, on wagons, on mules, or on foot. And don't forget the bandages. Battlefield wounds were messy, deep, and dirty. Every campaign needed medics, stretchers, rolls of linen, ointments, and prayers. Blood had to be mopped up, wounds sewn shut, limbs cut off. Sometimes surgeons were hired for a campaign, and they charged by the body. In other cases, monasteries along the route would offer help for a price. Healing was slow and costly, and most men did not return the same. There were also bribes. Not everyone wanted to fight. Sometimes, an enemy city could be convinced to surrender if the price was right. Lords sent coins ahead of armies, hoping to sway mercenaries to turn, to persuade a bishop to stay neutral, to pay off border guards to look the other way. A quiet war was often cheaper than a loud one, and it was always easier to count gold than corpses. Mercenaries themselves were another bill entirely. Not all soldiers fought for honor. Many fought for coin. Mercenary companies roamed the continent, well-trained, often ruthless, and always expensive. They charged by the week, by the man, or by the mission. If they weren't paid on time, they didn't wait politely. They looted. Or worse, they joined the other side. And then there were walls. Sieges were long and boring, but also costly. You needed siege towers, battering rams, catapults, or gunpowder later on. All of these took time to build, and even more time to move. Keeping men fed and paid during a siege could take months. Disease spread, morale dropped. Treasuries emptied long before the walls cracked. So who paid for all this? Sometimes kings, sometimes nobles, often peasants. Taxes were raised before wars began. Clergy were asked to contribute. Merchants were leaned on. Towns were asked to send money or food in support. Entire harvests were taken to feed armies. Fields were trampled by horses. Homes were turned into supply stations. War reached everyone, even those who never held a sword. And when wars went badly, when armies lost, when commanders were captured, when castles burned, someone had to pay the ransom. Noble prisoners weren't just taken, they were priced. A captured earl could cost a fortune to free. Families sold land, borrowed money, pawned relics, just to bring their sons home. Some never managed it. Their names faded. Their debts remained. Victory wasn't cheap either. After battles, there were feasts, celebrations, thanksgivings at cathedrals, new titles to grant. Sometimes new roads had to be built or destroyed, bridges replaced, coins were minted with new faces, old oaths rewritten. All of it added up, one hammered coin at a time. And in the quiet years, when no battles raged and the fields turned gold under summer sun, the cost of past wars lingered. Taxes didn't go down. Widows didn't remarry. Burnt villages didn't rebuild overnight. The scars of war outlasted the men who fought it. It's easy to think of medieval war as knights clashing under banners, but behind each swing of a sword was a ledger. Behind every trumpet call was a contract. Behind every charge, a receipt. War was never just blood and honor. It was barrels, buttons, bridles, and bread. And when the noise ended, when the shouting stopped and the kings went home, someone still had to pay the butcher's bill. So much of medieval war wasn't about kings, crowns, or even countries. It was personal, deeply, sometimes embarrassingly, personal. Feuds between noble families could grow like ivy, slow, silent, and stubborn, wrapping themselves around castles and counties until they choked the peace right out of the land. It didn't always start with blood. Sometimes it began with something as small as a refused marriage proposal, or a hunting dog that strayed across the wrong field, or a knight who took the wrong banner into a tournament and bruised a duke's pride more than his helmet. In a world where status was everything, honor could be cracked by a single word. And once it cracked, it often shattered. These grudges didn't fester in the dark. They were paraded around like ceremonial swords. You might find them tucked into songs sung by minstrels or hinted at during tense dinners between powerful lords. There might be a toast, and beneath the words, "To peace," a dagger-like stare across the hall. Everyone at the table would know. Something old, bitter, and unresolved was still alive between those two men. In some corners of the Holy Roman Empire, entire counties could become pawns in these personal dramas. Take, for instance, the feud between the houses of Waldburg and Wardenburg in the 14th century. What began as a squabble over inheritance eventually dragged on for decades. Castles were raided, crops burned, and peasants caught between had no idea whose taxes they were supposed to be paying. One day, they'd be loyal subjects of Lord Waldburg. The next, Württemberg's banner would be fluttering above the same fortress, and no one would dare say the other name aloud. In France, similar feuds spilled out between the Armagnacs and Burgundians. Technically, both supported the French crown. In reality, they spent much of the 15th century slicing at each other through urban skirmishes, midnight assassinations, and long, grudging silences. It was like watching two brothers fight at a family gathering, except the brothers had armies, and the family gathering was Paris. The English had their own version too. The Percy Neville feud in the 1450s might sound like a tale of polite dinner guests quarreling over table seating, but these were two massive northern families, and their conflict, full of ambushes, kidnappings, and open brawls, was a direct road into the Wars of the Roses. What began as a local dispute over land and influence turned into a dynastic war that lasted decades, all because one nobleman thought another was being too ambitious. Duels were another way of settling these grudges, but they were never quite as neat as the ballads would suggest. While trial by combat had religious and legal meaning early on, by the late Middle Ages, duels were mostly about pride. Think of two knights, each in finely polished armor, standing in a grassy clearing behind some monastery. Each swore loudly about his innocence, or his right to insult the other's sister at the last banquet. What followed was often slow, muddy, and exhausting. And despite the pageantry, there was no guarantee it would actually solve anything. Sometimes, the duel was canceled before the swords were even drawn. In 1386, a famous case in France involved Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris. Former friends turned bitter enemies after an accusation of assault. They were allowed to settle it by duel in front of the king. The crowd waited in breathless silence. The two men charged, slashed, rolled, and fought with brutal desperation. When it was over, one lay dead, the other vindicated, at least in the eyes of the court. History, of course, still argues about who was right. Even the church, usually so stern about violence, struggled to contain these disputes. Monks might preach peace, but they were also often scribes for noble families. That meant they were sometimes writing letters asking for help, forgiveness, or revenge. A monastery could be a place of quiet prayer, or a place where messengers galloped in with fresh news of a cousin's insult that absolutely had to be answered with fire and sword. These feuds could smolder for generations. A grandson might be born already sworn to hate the descendants of a family his grandfather once crossed swords with over the border of a sheep pasture. The original cause was often forgotten, but the bitterness remained, inherited like a title. And sometimes, in the rarest of cases, it ended with an apology. A wedding between rival houses might finally stitch the wounds closed. An aging lord might step down and leave his feud behind. Or war might wear everyone down to the point where no one remembered why they were still fighting. That's when treaties were quietly signed, debts were forgiven, and grudges folded into memory. But until that moment came, the wars continued. Quiet ones, loud ones, bloody and pointless ones, all because one noble couldn't let go of what another had said, done, or claimed as his own. It's a strange thing to imagine today. Entire regions set ablaze over bruised pride. But in the Middle Ages, honor was currency, and a noble name carried the weight of steel. If someone scratched it, no matter how lightly, it demanded a response. Not always wise, rarely clean, but to them, absolutely necessary. So tonight, as you drift deeper into rest, think not of kings on high thrones, but of squabbling lords pacing inside torchlit halls, muttering about insults long past and planning something foolish before the sun rises. The kind of battles no one really wanted. And yet somehow, everyone fought. Now, let it all grow quiet again. The halls are empty. The banners are down. And the feud, for now, has gone to sleep. But before swords clashed and banners tore in the wind, there was the road, long, winding, often wet, always slow. War in the Middle Ages didn't begin with the strike of a blade. It began with paperwork, cold mornings, and the smell of horses. The call to arms could come in many forms: a wax-sealed letter, a messenger on horseback, or a bell rung in the square. A king or a duke would declare his intent, often in the name of justice, honor, or vengeance. But behind those grand words was something much less poetic. Weeks, sometimes months of planning. War was expensive. War was messy. And nothing about it happened quickly. First came the mustering of men. Lords summoned their vassals, who in turn summoned their peasants. Knights strapped on mail. Foot soldiers dug out their boots from wherever they'd thrown them last harvest. Men were not always eager. Many were farmers. Others were craftsmen. Some were pressed into service by obligation, some by coin. Loyalty had its price, and often that price was bread, beer, and the hope of loot. Gathering took place at a designated spot, a field outside a castle, the edge of a forest, the base of a hill. There was no uniform. A medieval army was a quilt of colors and flags, each man wearing what he could afford, and each group bearing its lord's emblem stitched awkwardly on a sleeve or painted on a wooden shield. It was not the stuff of paintings. It was more like a traveling village with bad hygiene and too many weapons. Once everyone was assembled, the real hardship began. Campaigning meant marching, not for a day, but often for weeks. The army might move only 10 or 12 miles a day, slowed by carts, livestock, and mud that sucked at boots like hungry mouths. Roads were few and poorly kept. More often, armies trudged along paths made by hooves and wheels rather than stone or brick. The food situation was rarely ideal. Each man carried some rations: salted pork, barley bread, dried beans. But it never lasted. Armies foraged. They took from the land, which meant from villages, not always kindly. War walked with hunger, and hunger often left bruises on the faces of those who had nothing to give. If a nearby town surrendered willingly, they might be spared. If not, even before the swords were drawn, fires could start. Camp life was its own kind of misery. Tents were rare luxuries, often only for knights and higher officers. Most men slept under the stars, or under their cloaks in the rain. Fires smoked more than they warmed. Latrines were shallow pits dug hurriedly and abandoned just as fast. A campaign smelled of smoke, sweat, manure, and boiled onions if you were lucky. Yet, in the midst of the hardship, there were moments of strange normalcy. Storytelling by the fire, dice games scratched into the dirt, jokes in every dialect, arguments too, different languages, different customs, all thrown together in a forced fellowship. Soldiers were not just from one place. A royal army might include Welsh archers, French knights, German mercenaries, and English footmen. Communication was limited, but they all knew when to march and when to stop. Discipline varied. Some armies moved with rigid order, others with something closer to organized chaos. Drums and horns helped keep the rhythm of movement. A knight might bark orders, but a clever sergeant kept men from drifting off. Desertion was a constant worry. Many slipped away at night. Some returned home. Others simply vanished into the woods. Then there were the animals. Horses for knights, yes, but also oxen, donkeys, and mules pulling carts filled with weapons, food, and spare shoes. There were blacksmiths, cooks, scribes, priests, and even jesters walking alongside the fighters. A medieval army was not just soldiers. It was a moving ecosystem, dragging its survival behind it like a snail with a fragile shell. Crossing rivers meant delays. Bridges were rare and often too narrow or too weak. Men waded through, holding armor above their heads, slipping, swearing. Carts tipped, supplies floated away, morale dipped, and still, the army moved on. Every morning began the same way, with a horn or bell and the slow, stiff rising of men who had not slept well. Cold air greeted them, boots still wet from yesterday, a cold breakfast, if any. Then the march resumed. Somewhere ahead, days or weeks away, was the enemy. But most men did not think about that until they had to. They thought about blisters, about the next meal, about the ache in their back, and about how they'd rather be anywhere else, especially home. If they were lucky, there was no battle. Sometimes, war was a bluff. One army marched just to intimidate. Sometimes they arrived to find the enemy gone, or peace had been made over a goblet of wine and a signed scroll. Then they turned around, just like that. Weeks of walking, wasted. But if battle did come, it was often sudden. The army would stop, the scouts would return, lines would form. And just like that, the long, slow road to war would reach its end. Swords would be drawn, prayers whispered, helmets fastened. All the boredom, all the dirt and cold, now sharpened into a single, breathless moment. But none of that, the clash, the shouts, the chaos, could happen without the march, without the endless footsteps, without the quiet nights spent beneath wet cloaks. War was not only about killing, it was about walking, slowly, together, towards something none of them fully understood. And so, before the banners waved and the arrows flew, there were just men, hungry, tired, aching, marching toward whatever fate the road held next. There are no swords swinging tonight, no horns, no charges, no banners waving in the wind. Just quiet. You're somewhere off the beaten path, tucked behind a thicket of thorny trees, a little way from a muddy road that nobody has bothered to fix since the last campaign. The battle is still a few days away, if it even happens at all. And so, for now, like thousands of others across the centuries, you find yourself in the middle of a medieval military camp. The first thing that hits you isn't the sound of marching or the clash of arms. It's the smell. A thick mix of horses, unwashed men, cooked onions, and something else that's hard to place. Something like boiled leather and damp earth. The air is heavy with it, and no one seems to notice anymore. You do at first, but eventually it fades into the background, like the buzzing of flies. You're surrounded by hundreds, maybe thousands of men, not all of them soldiers. Some carry swords and wear padded tunics stained with old blood and oil. Others carry ladles, rolls of linen, or parchments covered in bad handwriting. There are cooks, blacksmiths, washerwomen, squires, scribes, and one man who hasn't stopped shouting about dice since sunrise. The camp is arranged in rough rows, a patchwork of tents, some canvas, others just patched cloth held up with sticks and twine. The nobles and commanders have larger tents with proper bedding and rugs on the floor. Most others sleep on the ground, curled up with cloaks and whatever straw they can scavenge. Sometimes they sleep with their boots on, especially when the ground's too wet to trust. Someone's boiling stew over a low fire nearby. You walk past and see what's inside. Barley, cabbage, a few limp carrots, and something brown that might once have been meat. Nobody's asking questions. You eat it because you're hungry, and because tomorrow it might just be bread and water, or nothing at all. Water is fetched from a stream about a quarter-mile away. It's muddy and full of leaves, but a good bucketful can be boiled if someone has time. Wine and ale are safer, in theory, but supplies are running low. The drink is thinned out and sour. Still, many prefer it over the risk of a stomach bug. The camp medic has already seen 5 cases of something he calls the flux, and you don't want to be the 6th. The trees are dug a little farther off, deep trenches with rough planks laid across the top. There's no privacy, no dignity, and very little distance between the pit and the cook fires. Flies go wherever they please. At night, the camp quiets, though not all the way. There are always sounds, murmurs from tents, wheezing snores, the clink of dice tossed on a flat stone, and the low whistle of a sentry trying to stay awake. Someone hums a song in French. A group of archers tells stories about a barmaid in Bruges. No one remembers if she was real, but they tell it anyway, the same way every time. A priest walks through camp with a flickering candle stub, offering blessings for the next battle. Some kneel. Most don't. They've heard it before, and for many, the rituals have started to sound like marching songs, repetitive, comforting, half-believed. You pass by the far corner of the camp where the blacksmith is hammering out a dent in a helmet. Sparks leap up into the dark. He doesn't speak. He's been working since morning. There's another sword to sharpen, and another nail to punch through a boot sole that's come apart again. His hands are blackened and cracked. His nose runs. He doesn't stop. Nearby, the surgeon's tent is lit with a single oil lamp. There's no battle yet, but there's always work. Sprained ankles, broken teeth, festering cuts from splinters, or a pot of grease that spilled down someone's leg. He works with linen soaked in wine, a knife he heats over flame, and prayers he mutters between clenched teeth. His assistant fainted once last week, but came back. There's no one else to help. By morning, the frost will have crept over the tent ropes and into your boots. The fire will have burned down to dull coals. You'll rub your hands together, blow warm breath onto your fingers, and watch as your breath curls into the gray air like smoke from a dying chimney. You'll eat hard bread that cracks if you drop it, and maybe a slice of salted pork if the quartermaster didn't forget you again. Then someone will yell, a trumpet will sound, or perhaps there will be no noise at all. Just the slow rise of men from bedrolls and straw piles, stretching stiff limbs and stepping back into their armor. There's no talk of heroism in the morning, just groaning joints, tired curses, and men trying to lace up their boots without stepping in something unspeakable. And yet, there's a strange rhythm to it all. The camp, for all its mud and noise and stench, is a world of its own. It's not home, but it's familiar. There are friends here, some made during long marches, others found over dice games or shared stew. There are jokes that never get old. There's always someone singing, no matter how bad it sounds. You might hear a mandolin if you're lucky, or the rattle of spoons on a pot when someone's had too much to drink and fancies himself a bard. War is ugly, yes, but this part, this in-between, this quiet before the storm, is where the real memories are made, not in glory or bloodshed, but in cold mornings and hot broth, in clumsy jokes, in patched-up tents, in that feeling when the fire crackles and, for a few moments, the whole world seems to pause. You pull your cloak tighter and rest your head against a sack of onions. The man beside you snores through his mouth. Someone just dropped a bowl. A dog barks. And still, somehow, it's peaceful. This is camp life, forgotten by stories, but never by those who lived it. The camp is quiet. Only the slow crackling of firewood and the muffled clink of armor being unbuckled break the silence. Horses chew hay softly under a pale moon. Somewhere, a sentry walks the perimeter, boots sinking gently into damp earth. Everyone is exhausted. Not because they fought, but because they've spent the day trying to find someone to fight. Medieval warfare wasn't just sword swinging and trumpet blaring. It was waiting, marching, watching, and most of all, wondering. Where's the enemy? How many of them are there? And will they arrive tomorrow? Or are they already here? To answer these questions, commanders relied on a very quiet kind of soldier, the scout. Scouts rode out at dawn, often in pairs. They didn't wear bright colors or noble crests. They wore mud, silence, and worry. Their job wasn't to attack or defend, but to see and to return. They might spend hours crawling through brush just to get a glimpse of a campfire glow on the horizon. If they were lucky, they saw tents. If they were very lucky, they lived long enough to report what they saw. It was not a glamorous task. Scouts slept under bushes and ate what they could carry. If they were caught, they were not treated as prisoners. They were hanged as spies. And the border between scout and spy was thinner than parchment. Spies, you see, were not always strangers sneaking in from another land. Often, they were insiders. A servant in the enemy's kitchen, a monk who traveled freely between abbeys, a merchant who sold wine to both sides. These quiet figures were worth more than gold. In fact, they were often paid in it. Sometimes a whole battle turned on a whisper. At the siege of Chateau Gaillard in 1204, King Philip II of France needed a way into one of England's most heavily fortified castles. His soldiers couldn't break the walls, so he turned to something else: information. A local told the French about a small, hidden passage underneath the walls, a drain no one thought could be used. One night, French soldiers crawled through the chute and opened the gates from the inside. The siege was over. The castle fell not to strength, but to a secret. In the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302, the Flemish army, mostly made of townspeople and peasants, needed every advantage they could get against the heavily armored French knights. They sent spies into the countryside, collecting reports on where the French were marching. When the moment was right, the Flemish positioned themselves in a narrow field where the French cavalry couldn't maneuver. It worked. The knights charged straight into a trap. Not all spies were locals. Some were soldiers in disguise. Others were priests. There's even a record of a wandering musician in the 13th century who played in a noble's hall by night and scribbled down battle plans by morning. He wasn't caught. He simply vanished. But not all intelligence was gathered through sneaking around. Sometimes it was purchased. A bribe could be more powerful than a battering ram. A stable boy might take a few silver coins to tell you how many horses the enemy had. A disgruntled knight might accept a bag of gold to ride away at the start of battle. A castle guard, weary of war, might open the gates just a little too early. In the Italian wars of the late Middle Ages, cities regularly changed hands not because they were conquered, but because someone inside was paid not to resist. The banners on the towers changed. The bells rang differently, but the people inside barely stirred. No siege, no blood, just a transaction. And yet, betrayal was not always for money. Sometimes it was for love, or revenge, or fear. In the endless conflicts of the Iberian Peninsula, both Christian and Muslim leaders used local nobles to spy on each other. A single misplaced promise, or broken one, could shift the lines on the map by dozens of miles. One count might give away the route of a supply train. A rival knight might accidentally leave a gate open. Suddenly, a city would fall, and everyone would wonder how. Most commanders knew this. They feared it. And so they guarded information carefully. Orders were often delivered by hand, rolled into wax-sealed scrolls, or spoken quietly into trusted ears. Fake camps were built to throw off enemy spies. Fires were lit in patterns to send false messages. Even the color of a banner could be a trick. Misinformation was its own kind of weapon. But even with all this, most medieval armies fought half-blind. They rarely knew where the enemy really was until the two forces were nearly upon each other. That's why battles often happened by accident. A hill is rounded, a forest is crossed, and suddenly, the other army is there. No time for clever tactics, just enough time to draw weapons and pray. And so, scouts and spies became more valuable than any knight. Quiet heroes, shadowy threats. Their work decided the field before a sword ever left its sheath. By night, they listened for hoofbeats. By day, they counted fires. They watched birds scatter. They read tracks in the mud. They reported back to commanders who, sitting in tents with maps and candles, had to decide: attack, retreat, or wait. Sometimes their decisions were wise. Other times, they were catastrophes. But always, they were based on shadows, hints, and the softest of rumors. In the end, wars were not always won by strength. Sometimes, they were won by silence. The year is 1066. The place is a gentle slope outside a village called Hastings in the southern part of England. It is quiet now, just grass and wind, but once, this place was anything but calm. Before you, the hill stretches upward, not steep, but steady. At the top, behind a wall of wooden shields, stand rows of men. They are the army of King Harold Godwinson, last crowned Saxon King of England. Their faces are weathered. Their legs are sore. They've marched far from the north, where just weeks ago they fought another battle against a different invasion. But now, they hold the high ground, eyes fixed on what's coming up the rise. And what's coming is something new. At the bottom of the slope, banners flap in a cold breeze. Horses stamp and snort. Archers grip bows. Norman knights adjust their saddles. Duke William of Normandy, known later as the Conqueror, waits with an army not just of Normans, but Bretons and Flemish too. He has crossed the sea with hundreds of ships and now stands on English soil. His claim to the English crown is bold. His plan is simple. He will take it with force. It is the morning of October 14th. There are no horns yet, no charge, just silence and tension. On the hill, Harold's men press close together. They form what they call a shield wall, a line so tight you can't see between the boards. Shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, axe to hand. They are the housecarls, the king's best fighters. Behind them are local men, less trained, but just as afraid. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and fishermen, called here by duty. They don't wear much armor, just tunics, helmets if they're lucky, and a hope that numbers will protect them. Below, William makes the first move. His archers fire upward in long, curving arcs. The arrows fall down like angry rain, but the shield wall holds. The Saxons crouch in cover. Most of the arrows clatter harmlessly off the thick wooden boards. A few find gaps. A cry here, a grunt there. But the wall remains. Next come the infantry. Foot soldiers with swords and spears climb the hill in formation. They hit the wall with a crash of iron and shouts. There is no elegance here, just grunting, pushing, hacking, and falling. The Saxons do not break. They push back with their axes, huge two-handed blades that can split shield and bone in one swing. The first wave of Normans stumbles back down the hill. Then come the horses. This is what William counts on: heavy cavalry. Riders with long lances charge up the slope, hoping to scatter the defenders. But again, the shield wall holds. Horses hesitate. Some rear. Others slam into the line and their riders are pulled down, dragged away, crushed underfoot. For hours it continues like this. Arrows, infantry, cavalry. Again and again, William throws his army at the wall. And again, the wall refuses to fall. The hill is soaked in mud and blood, helmets dented, blades chipped, limbs broken, breath short. And then it happens. Some of William's men retreat. It is not clear if it's planned or panic, but when they run, part of Harold's army follows. A portion of the Saxons, perhaps too eager or too tired to wait, break formation and give chase. It's a mistake. The Normans, trained and ready, turn around and surround them. Isolated and unprotected, the Saxons who left the wall are cut down. One gap leads to another. Slowly, the shield wall begins to weaken. Not from force, but from human error. The Normans press harder. The archers adjust their aim. No longer shooting high, they now aim flat, directly at the thinning ranks. By late afternoon, the fighting shifts to the crest of the hill. The line has broken. The men are scattered. Confusion rules. Blood darkens the ground in patches where bodies lie in heaps. The grass is trampled. Helmets are lost. Shields are cracked. Somewhere in the chaos, King Harold is struck. There are many stories of how. Some say an arrow to the eye. Others say he was cut down by knights. What matters is that he falls, and with him, the hope of his army. By nightfall, the field belongs to the Normans. William does not march to London immediately, but this is the moment, the turning point. England, once ruled by Saxon kings, will soon become Norman. The language will shift. The laws will change. Castles will rise, where none stood before. And this quiet hill, this place called Senlac, will be remembered for a battle where stubborn resolve met tactical patience, and one shield wall, once unbreakable, finally gave way. But now, the field is quiet again. The men are gone. The shouting has faded. Just wind through the grass and the rustling of leaves. The sun sets softly, painting the slope in gold. The Battle of Hastings was not about heroism. It was about fatigue, missteps, discipline, and the grinding reality of war. There were no grand speeches, just cold steel and tired feet. And in the end, a crown passed not through peace, but through blood. Tonight, as you lie still, let your breath rise and fall like the calm after a storm. The shield wall has fallen. The banners are lowered. All that remains is silence and sleep. The year is 1176, and you are standing in the low fields near the village of Legnano, not far from Milan. The grass is damp from the morning dew. It glistens faintly under a pale spring sun. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings. It isn't a call to prayer. It's a warning. You don't know it yet, but the Holy Roman Emperor himself is on the move. And he's not alone. Frederick Barbarossa, crowned by a pope, armored in chainmail and known for his red beard and unbending pride, is riding south. He has crossed the Alps with knights behind him, German and imperial. They wear coats of arms. They carry long lances. They believe themselves invincible. But this is not their land, and the people here are not lords or soldiers. They are weavers, smiths, cobblers, and they are preparing to fight. The Lombard League, a union of northern Italian cities, was never meant to be a military power. These were places of trade and taxes, guilds and grumbling town meetings. But Frederick had tried to break them, burning Milan to the ground years before. And they remembered. This time, they would not wait behind stone walls. This time, they would meet him in the open. There's no roaring army marching out of Legnano. There's no wall of steel. Instead, there's a cart, a heavy one drawn by oxen. Atop it sits a large gleaming pole. Attached to that pole is a banner, the Carroccio, they call it. It's not just a flag. It is a symbol of their resolve. The town's priests have blessed it. Around it, men from every walk of life stand ready with polearms, shields, and worn leather boots. These are militia, not warriors. But they do not run. The day rises. The two forces face each other. One is proud and mounted, trained for war since birth. The other is grounded, unsure, but growing bolder with every heartbeat. Then, the charge begins. Knights thunder forward. The ground shudders under hooves. The sky darkens with arrows. The citizens' line breaks, then reforms. It breaks again. Then it stiffens. Crossbows click. Metal sings. And something strange begins to happen. Knights fall. Not many, but enough. The line does not collapse. Instead, the Carroccio stands tall, unmoved, guarded by men who have never worn armor before. The Emperor pushes harder. He commands more charges. More lances snap. More boots dig in. Then word spreads. His banner has fallen. Not once, but twice. It is a small thing, a flag in the dust, but it matters. Symbols matter. In this age, they mean more than numbers. Frederick vanishes in the confusion. For a time, no one knows where he is. His army thinks him dead. Panic spreads. The knights retreat. They do not regroup. The Emperor eventually reappears, bloodied but alive, though not victorious. Not this time. The Lombard League wins the day. And that changes everything. This is not just a battle. It is not merely about land or coin. It is the first time that citizen militias, untrained, unarmored, have stood their ground and repelled an emperor's knights. And emperors take notice. From this moment on, the idea that only nobility can wield power in battle begins to crack. Slowly, quietly, but it cracks. In the years that follow, the Peace of Constance is signed. It allows the Italian cities more freedom than they ever expected. It marks a turning point in the relationship between cities and crowns, between local rule and imperial command. Back in Legnano, the Carroccio is preserved, not just as a relic of war, but as a memory of unity. For generations, people will speak of the day when craftsmen and merchants stood together and held the line. Not because they were trained to, but because they chose to. The battlefield itself softens with time. Grass grows again. Birds return. But the story remains. Not one of glory or grandeur, but of quiet determination, of ordinary people choosing not to kneel. You sit now by a small hill where the final clash happened. There is no noise, just the wind. Perhaps the faint clink of a bell tied to a distant ox, grazing near where the Carroccio once stood. There are no shouts here anymore. No thunder. Only peace. The story of the Battle of Legnano is not a tale of overwhelming force or brilliant strategy. It is not even about a decisive military victory. It is about courage without armor, about belief held together by rope and prayer. It's about how, sometimes, the most frightening thing to an emperor is not a sword, but a city that dares to say no. Meanwhile, the wind rolled gently across the Hungarian plain. It was spring, 1241. Wildflowers swayed in the grass near the Sajo River, unaware of what was coming. The sky, pale and quiet, held no warning. And yet just beyond the hills, an army moved with a calm that made no sound. Riders cloaked in silence, horses trained not to whinny. These were not crusaders or knights. They were Mongols. The Kingdom of Hungary had known raids before. But this was different. This time, the warning had come months earlier, from Poland, where cities had burned and rivers ran dark. King Bela IV had gathered his forces, knights in iron coats, archers on foot, and levies from the countryside. They were brave. They were devout. But they had never seen what was coming. The Mongols arrived not as a wave, but as a mist, spreading, thinning, dividing, surrounding. They didn't march in rows. They didn't wear banners that fluttered in the wind. Their horses moved fast, light, and never stopped long. Commanded by Batu Khan and the brilliant General Subutai, their strategy was built on patience, trickery, and devastating speed. By April, both armies had reached the river Sajo. On one side, the Hungarians set up camp in a forested area near the village of Mohi. King Bela ordered a bridge defended, thinking it would slow the Mongols. And for a moment, it worked. A small Mongol unit attacked the bridge and was repelled. Cheers rose from the Hungarian side. The king believed they had stopped the horde. But Subutai had built another bridge, a secret one, upriver, made overnight from raw wood and rope. It made no noise. It was guarded by no drums. At dawn on April 11th, the Mongol forces crossed it in silence. And when they reached the other side, they struck. The attack came like a storm with no thunder. Arrows flew in arcs that blotted out the light. Horses circled. The Hungarian knights tried to form lines, but they found themselves boxed in. Every time they turned to push forward, the Mongols had already moved. Subutai's forces used smoke, not fire, not magic, just smoldering branches, to blind the enemy and cut off their sight. The battlefield turned into a maze of shadows and confusion. Some knights charged blindly. Their horses crashed into wagons, trees, even their own men. Others tried to retreat, but found their escape blocked by Mongol riders who had already looped behind them. It was not a battle of clashing swords. It was a trap closing, inch by inch. King Bela tried to break free. He fled with a small group of guards, riding hard through the forests, over rivers, across the border. He would live. But most of his army did not. By the end of the day, the Hungarian camp lay in ruins. Smoke drifted from cooking fires turned to ash. Bodies lay still in the grass where flowers had stood just that morning. Silence returned, but it was heavier now. The wind no longer carried the sound of birdsong. The Mongols didn't stay long. Their campaigns were swift. They moved west, striking into Austria and beyond. But then, suddenly, they turned around. News had reached Batu Khan that the great Khan Ogadai had died. According to Mongol law, all leaders had to return to choose a new ruler. Europe, by chance, was spared further destruction. The Battle of Mohi was more than just a fight. It was a warning. European warfare was changing. Heavy armor, stone castles, and noble charges were not enough against speed, planning, and precision. The Mongols used maps. They studied terrain. They divided armies to confuse and surround. Their arrows were not fired at targets. They were fired into rhythms, designed to disrupt, to terrorize, to break the flow of defense. In Hungary, villages took years to rebuild. Fields were left untended. A generation of young men had vanished, and the name Mongol was whispered with fear for decades. But not all was lost. Slowly, lessons were learned. Kingdoms began to study cavalry. Roads were improved, fortresses redesigned. In a way, the horror of Mohi helped shape the Europe that came after. Today, The battlefield is quiet again. The Sajo River still flows. Birds nest in the trees. The wind carries no arrows, only the rustle of leaves and the whisper of a time when an army came and vanished, as if drawn in smoke. You're standing on warm stone. The air smells of salt, smoke, and dust. Beneath your feet, the walls of Acre stretch wide, cracked, ancient, and groaning quietly under the weight of another dawn. It's spring in 1291, but the flowers have long since given up blooming. The breeze that once carried spices and ship songs now brings only ash from the east. This is the last stronghold of the Crusaders in the Holy Land, and the enemy is already at the gates. You don't hear shouting, not yet. Only the steady creak of worn armor. Boots shuffle across towers. Crossbow strings are being drawn again. Men speak in low tones, not out of fear, but fatigue. These walls have held for weeks. Each morning begins the same, with hope thin as parchment. Each night ends with fewer voices. Acre had once been a glittering city. Merchants from Genoa, Venice, and Marseille filled its stone marketplaces with silk, saffron, pearls, and lies. Pilgrims came to pray, thieves came to follow them, and warriors came to die, all in the name of a cross painted onto shields and cloaks. But now, only the defenders remain, and not many at that. The Mamluk Sultan, Al-Ashraf Khalil, surrounds the city with tens of thousands of men, well-fed, well-armed, and tireless. His cannons, still a novelty in this part of the world, are pushed forward inch by inch. Siege towers rise like skeletal fingers. Battering rams swing with slow patience. And yet, each day the Knights Templar fight them back. One more day. Just one more. The Templars stand like ghosts in white, red crosses stitched against the grime. They speak little, sleep less. Behind them, the women and children of the city wait in the cathedrals and storehouses, anywhere with a roof, anywhere with walls. Prayers are whispered not for victory, but for ships. Genoese ships, Venetian ships, any ships, but the harbor remains mostly empty. Few want to sail into a lost cause. From this high tower, you can see the pattern now. Every morning, the Mamluks test a section of wall. Arrows whistle, ladders rise, boiling oil hisses, and somehow the city endures. The defenders push back, not with strength, but with memory. This is the last holdout of Christendom in the Holy Land. If it falls, the dream ends, and no one wants to be the last one left alive to watch that happen. A few knights walk past. One carries a cracked helm under his arm. Another clutches a relic, something small wrapped in linen. They don't speak. No orders today, just quiet understanding. Every man knows what this is. And then the dust shifts. It starts with a thud, not loud but deep. A section of the outer wall is crumbling. Cannons have weakened it for days. Now the stones fall one by one like slow rain. Someone shouts. A bell rings. Once. Then again. And the tide breaks. The Mamluks charge, not as a wave, but as a flood. Foot soldiers with curved blades, cavalry in lamellar armor, archers who don't miss. They rush toward the breach with a roar, not of anger, but certainty. This is not their first siege, and this wall will not hold. The Templars run to meet them, not back, forward, toward the breach. You follow down the narrow steps, stone slick with sweat, into the dust, into the smoke. The noise is thick now. Crossbow bolts thunk into shields. Swords meet in dull clangs. The city groans underfoot, and still they fight. But the line is too thin. There are too few defenders, and behind them, the city begins to burn. Fires crawl along the rooftops. No one lights them on purpose anymore. They just happen now, like a slow shrug from the earth. In the chaos, you find yourself near the harbor. Ships are there, only a few. The wealthy are already aboard. Others crowd the docks, clutching whatever they can carry. Bread, holy books, crying children. Some are turned away. Some jump into the sea, trying to swim. The water does not forgive. Back at the heart of the city, the Templar headquarters, solid, gray, and defiant, remains. Dozens of knights gather inside. It is not a fortress anymore. It is a tomb. They have no illusions. This is the last stand. When the Mamluks breach the outer gate, there is no more strategy. Only steel. Street by street, they take the city. The Templars fight in alleys and churches. They die in doorways and beside cisterns. And still, they do not surrender. By nightfall, Acre is quiet again. But it is a quiet full of smoke and crows and footsteps in the ash. The last Templars, surrounded, retreat into their stronghold. The Mamluks offer terms. The knights do not answer. A day passes, then two. On the third, the Templars open the gates, but they do not surrender. They charge. One final ride into death, into fire, into memory. And then, there are no more Templars in Acre. The city, once shining, is emptied. The streets echo with new tongues. The cross is torn from towers. The relics are buried or burned. And the Holy Land, for the first time in almost 200 years, belongs to someone else. You're standing in a field just before dawn. The grass is wet beneath your feet. Somewhere in the dark, a rooster tries to crow but gives up halfway. A thin fog rolls over the hills, and there, across the earth's quiet hush, figures begin to move, slowly at first, then all at once. Metal glints as helmets are lifted, leather creaks, blades are checked, but no one is stomping like a tin man. No one is dragging 30 kilos of armor behind them. That myth, the one where knights could barely move, is not entirely true. In fact, most knights could dance if they wanted to. Let's begin with the armor itself. When you picture a knight, maybe you imagine a full suit of steel gleaming in the sunlight like a mirror with limbs. That image did exist, but it came late in the medieval period, and only a few nobles could afford it. Before that, the go-to protection was chainmail, or, as they called it back then, just mail. Chainmail is a modern term, like saying sword blade or bread loaf. Mail was made of thousands of interlinked metal rings, carefully forged and joined by hand. It draped over the body like a shirt and reached down to the knees, sometimes with a coif for the head and mittens for the hands. It didn't stop the force of a blow, but it did help keep sharp blades from opening you like a melon. It weighed somewhere between 15 to 25 kilograms, spread across the body. Heavy, yes, but manageable if you trained with it. Soldiers learned to ride, climb, fight, and fall wearing it. You wouldn't float in water, but you wouldn't waddle like a duck either. Later came plate armor, not instantly and not all at once. First, a breastplate, then greaves for the shins, gauntlets for the hands. It was an arms race of sorts, and blacksmiths were the quiet geniuses behind it all. A full suit of plate might weigh 20 to 30 kilograms, about the same as modern military gear. But here's the secret. It was beautifully balanced. Articulated joints let the knight move naturally. You could roll, run, mount a horse, even do a cartwheel if you were foolish enough. Yes, a knight in plate could get back on his horse without help. No crane, no pulley, just a bit of effort and a good grip. Now, not everyone had access to such fine work. Enter the peasants, the militia, the farmers with a spear in one hand and their fate in the other. They didn't wear shining steel. They wore padded jackets called gambesons, thick layers of quilted linen stuffed with horsehair or scrap wool. And they were surprisingly effective. A well-made gambeson could absorb a sword strike. It was cheap, easy to repair, and didn't rust in the rain. Many foot soldiers, especially in earlier centuries, went into battle with nothing but this padded coat, a wooden shield, and something long and sharp. That sharp something was often a spear, and it was glorious in its simplicity. You didn't need years of training to use a spear. Just point the metal bit at the angry man running toward you. Spears were cheap to make, easy to carry, and surprisingly versatile. You could jab, throw, or even plant it in the ground to stop a charging horse. A wooden polearm with a steel head might weigh just 2 to 4 kilograms. With 10 men holding a spear wall, you didn't need armor. You needed courage and good timing. Now, about swords. Ah, the romance of it all. Most medieval swords were not heavy. The average arming sword weighed between 1 to 1.5 kilograms. Even the mighty two-handed greatswords didn't exceed 2.5 to 3 kilograms. If it were heavier, you couldn't swing it fast enough to matter. A sword wasn't meant to hack through armor like firewood. It was a tool, fast, responsive, meant for thrusts, cuts, and counters. There's a rhythm to swordplay. A dance, really. You don't crash through the enemy like an avalanche. You wait, you feint, you step. The blade becomes an extension of your arm. It doesn't matter how much it weighs if it's well balanced. Medieval smiths understood this better than we give them credit for. Other weapons were more brutal. Maces, for example, were made to crush. A steel-headed club with no blade, just blunt force. They were effective against armor, especially mail. A war hammer, smaller than you'd think, was not a carpenter's tool. It was designed to punch through helmets and dent breastplates. A popular choice was the axe, both humble and horrifying. A peasant's woodcutter axe could be adapted for war, but a proper battle axe, made with a longer handle and a broader edge, could cleave through shields and bone. Some soldiers carried flails, the infamous spiked ball on a chain, but they weren't very common. They were hard to control, hard to store, and more likely to hit your own foot if you weren't careful. And yes, bows. English longbows required incredible strength to draw, often 100 to 120 pounds of force. Archers trained from boyhood. Their bones were permanently bent from years of practice. The arrows they loosed weren't pinpricks. They were hand-forged, iron-tipped missiles capable of puncturing armor at range. But no matter the weapon, what mattered more was the person holding it. Training, discipline, and timing mattered far more than raw strength or brute equipment. A poor knight with fine armor was still a poor knight. A farm boy with a spear and good instincts might change the tide of a skirmish. Battles weren't decided by weight. They were decided by movement, teamwork, terrain, and luck. And by the time twilight fell on the battlefield, those fine suits of armor and glittering blades were covered in mud, blood, and dust. Most were stripped from the dead. The rest were carried home, dented and scraped for another day. So, as you rest your head tonight, picture not clumsy tin men lumbering across a field, but skilled fighters in well-worn gear, moving like water, thinking like wolves, knights who knew how to roll with a fall, peasants who stood firm with pointed sticks, archers with fingers like iron. Medieval war wasn't elegant, but it wasn't foolish either, and none of it was as heavy as the myths make it seem. Now close your eyes. The battlefield is quiet again. The swords are back in their scabbards. The mail is cooling in the dust, and not a single soul is stomping like a robot. Only the wind moves now, and it's light as a feather. But sometimes it doesn't begin with horns. Not the kind you hear in movies, anyway. There is no swelling music, no choirs rising in the background, just footsteps. Slow at first, then faster. Some feet are bare, some in cracked leather, others armored in thick boots, all of them walking toward the same place. And that place is chaos. The first sound you notice is breathing. It's heavy, ragged. Too many men wore armor that didn't quite fit. Rust creaks when they move. One man coughs, another mutters a prayer in Latin, but he gets half the words wrong. He's not a priest. He's a baker. And this is his first time holding a sword. Somewhere nearby, a horse shifts its weight. Its hooves clop against dry earth. Its rider adjusts his position in the saddle. The armor clinks, the leather straps groan. A bit clicks between teeth. The horse snorts. It doesn't like the noise any more than you do. Then there's the sound of banners, fabric catching in the breeze. It flutters overhead. Each banner shows a symbol, a color, a name, but the men below barely look up at them. They're too busy adjusting helmets, wiping sweat from their brows, or pretending not to be terrified. A trumpet does blow, eventually, but it's not grand. It's thin, shrill, like someone stepped on a goose. It signals something, though most aren't sure what. One man starts walking forward, then two more follow. The line stirs, and suddenly, the quiet breaks. You hear shields bump together, wood against wood. The hollow thunk of it repeats like a heartbeat. Some men chant, others shout, not out of courage, but to drown out the voice inside their head saying, "Run!" The enemy moves too. Their boots drum the ground. Metal glints under the sun. Someone bangs a sword against a shield. It's rhythmic. Clash, pause, clash again. Not music. More like the sound of someone knocking on a door you don't want to open. When they collide, it's not graceful. It's not a dance. It's a crash. The first thing you hear is wood breaking. Spears snap like twigs against metal. Shields split at the seams. The thud of a mace meeting a helmet is heavy, like dropping a sack of grain onto stone. Bones don't crack in one clean break. They crunch. They twist. They make a sound you feel in your stomach. Men shout names they hope someone will hear. Some scream just to stay grounded. Others grunt with each strike, as if the sound will make their swords swing faster. Some make no noise at all, only wide eyes and clenched jaws. Horses scream too. A war horse sounds nothing like the calm ones you see in fields. When panicked, they shriek, sharp and high, a sound that slices through the roar of the crowd. If a horse falls, it hits the ground like a cart full of stones. The rider goes with it, tangled in reins and stirrups, the breath knocked out of him. You might hear metal grind against metal, but not often. Swords don't clash perfectly in the air, like in stage fights. They miss. They slip. They dig into flesh or wedge into wooden shields. The sharper the weapon, the quieter its work. Then there are the arrows. You don't hear them fly. You hear them land. A soft thwack. A wet thunk. A man groans. Another falls. Arrows don't announce themselves. They arrive in silence. Sometimes the only warning is the rustle of feathers in the wind, if you're lucky. And still, there are voices, not speeches, not orders shouted like in the stories, just confused shouting. Someone yells to go left. Someone else says to fall back. One knight thinks they're winning. The soldier beside him thinks they're about to die. They argue in the middle of the chaos, as if anyone is listening. Somewhere, a priest whispers a final prayer over a dying man. His voice is calm. It's the only calm thing in miles. Pax vobiscum, he says. Peace be with you. The dying man doesn't respond. He's already gone. The smell, if you're wondering, is awful. Sweat, blood, mud, the stink of fear. Bowels often let go when the body dies. It's not noble, it's just real. But back to the sound. As the fight drags on, the noise changes. It becomes slower, like a fire burning down. Men get tired, swords grow heavy, voices turn hoarse, screams fade into groans. Armor that once gleamed is now smeared in dirt and grime. Crows gather. You don't hear them until it's nearly over, but they're already watching. They perch on broken wagons and half-fallen trees, waiting for the silence to return. Eventually, it does. Not all at once. First, the thundering feet slow. Then the shouts thin out. One last arrow flies. One last sword drops. And then, stillness. The field is quiet again, but it's not peaceful. It's the quiet that comes after a storm, where everything is broken. Men lie still. Some pretend to be dead. Some wish they were. A horse limps past, riderless, reins trailing in the dust. You hear someone sob, not loudly, just a slow, soft cry, like they've forgotten how to stop. A healer calls out, looking for the wounded. A boy, too young to have fought, walks through the bodies, searching for someone he knew. And that's the true sound of battle, not trumpets and glory, but a rising storm of panic, rage, and pain, followed by a hush so deep it feels like the world itself is holding its breath. If you expected music, you won't find it here. But if you listen closely, you might hear something else. The breath of a survivor, the groan of a cart pulling the injured home, the distant ring of a church bell announcing that it's over. At least for now. So rest easy. You've walked the battlefield and come back. The clang of war has faded. The world has quieted again. All that remains is the wind, the crows, and the steady hush of time moving on. The battlefield stretches before you, quiet for now. A wide patch of churned earth dotted with broken shields, snapped lances, and the last echoes of marching boots. Somewhere nearby, a trumpet will sound, but not yet. For now, the men stand still. The foot soldiers, the ones who have walked for days, sleep on damp cloaks, their spears planted in the ground beside them like wooden gravestones. You are among them, one of the infantry. You do not wear fine armor. Your tunic is patched and stained, your boots tied with strips of old linen. Your helmet is iron, but thin. Your weapon is not elegant, just a long shaft of ash wood tipped with cold steel. A spear, simple, but not to be underestimated. For all the shining armor and galloping banners, This is how medieval battles were won. By those on foot. By formations of tired men, holding lines and gripping spears. The cavalry may have drawn the noble songs, but the infantry held the line when it mattered most. It begins with sound. Not a scream, but a distant pounding, like thunder. Hooves. You hear them before you see them. The cavalry approaches, a line of horses bearing armored knights, each man with a lowered lance and a war cry. The earth seems to move with them. The sky remains still. Your grip tightens. There is no running. You are not alone. You are part of a wall now, an organized square or row, depending on your commander's design. Shields interlock, spears angle forward, feet press into the soil. The noise rises, hooves crashing louder now, closer, relentless. You do not speak. None of you do. It is hard to talk when fear is thick in your throat. But you hold. This is the moment where most stories leap to the night. The heroic charge, the polished armor flashing in the sun. But here, among the infantry, there is something just as brave. You are asked not to move, to stand while death races toward you, to keep your spear aimed at a beast galloping with 2 tons of force and a rider with a blade. Infantry learned this over time. In the early medieval period, foot soldiers were often poorly armed and poorly trained. They broke easily when faced with cavalry. Battles like Hastings in 1066 saw shields splinter and lines fall. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, armies had changed. Infantry formations became smarter. Leaders studied past mistakes. They knew horses, no matter how powerful, would not run headfirst into a solid wall of spears. At Bannockburn, in the year 1314, Scottish infantry stood in tight formations called schiltrons. These were like human hedgehogs, rows of men with pikes so long they could stop a knight before he reached the front line. The English cavalry charged again and again, but the spears held firm. The knights fell. The battle was won not by mounted lords, but by common men who dug their heels into the ground. The same pattern unfolded elsewhere. In the Swiss Alps, peasant soldiers formed pike squares that shattered the myth of knightly invincibility. In Flanders, city militias used long poles and discipline to halt feudal armies. The rise of the infantry was not glamorous. It was methodical, measured, quiet. But it changed everything. Back in the field, the charge crashes into your line. The sound is sharp and splintering, wood against metal, hooves slipping in mud, men shouting not out of fear but effort. Your spear bends but holds. The rider in front of you jerks sideways, his horse panicking as it meets the wall. Another rider goes down, caught between 2 spear points. One of your comrades screams. You don't look. You can't. The second wave is already coming. Infantry did not need to outrun horses. They only needed to outlast them, to break the charge. Once a knight was on the ground, his horse dead, his legs tangled. He was vulnerable. Armor is heavy. It protects well, but not against a dozen boots and blades from below. There were rules, of course, and orders shouted by commanders. But in the thick of it, the fight was closer than any painting can show. A sword swings from above. A pike stabs from below. Blood on your hands might not even be yours. You grip tighter. The enemy blinks, falls. You don't notice the ache in your arms until later. When the dust clears, the cavalry has retreated. at least for now, you are still standing, tired, bruised, alive. Infantry battles were long and slow. They rarely ended in grand cinematic sweeps. They were measured in minutes that felt like hours, in feet gained and lost, in the slow grind of willpower and strategy. Cavalry charges could fail in seconds. But infantry held until the end. This is why commanders began to favor soldiers like you, not just for your numbers, but your consistency. A knight was expensive. His horse had to be trained, his armor fitted, his weapon forged. But you could be trained with a spear in a week. You could hold a pike, learn to keep time with your fellows, and move as one. And once the idea of professional armies grew stronger, infantry became the core. Not just defense, offense too. With crossbows and longbows added to their ranks, foot soldiers could strike from afar. At Crécy and Agincourt, English archers devastated waves of French knights. The field was ruled not by nobles on horseback, but by peasants behind stakes and strings. The balance had shifted, and still, you stand. The battle is not yet over, but the fear has passed. The wall has held. The cavalry will think twice before charging again. Somewhere behind the lines, someone sings a half-remembered tune. Another pulls off a dented helmet and laughs. You're not sure why. Maybe relief, maybe madness. But for now, the line is quiet again. And tomorrow, the field will look different. Fewer hoofprints, more scars, and always, always, the steady print of boots, infantry, the backbone of war. Even when the knights are gone, the ground remembers their steps. It had rained all through the night. Cold, steady rain. The sort that seeps under cloaks and into boots, that softens fields into a slow, sucking mire. Somewhere in northern France, in a narrow strip of farmland, hemmed in by woods, thousands of men stood quietly, each man wrapped in damp wool, each hand tightening around something made for killing. The Battle of Agincourt was about to begin, but it would not look the way you imagine. There would be no glorious cavalry charge, no noble swordplay in bright sunlight, no clean flags fluttering against a blue sky. Number A. It was muddy. It was miserable. And it would become one of the most lopsided victories in medieval warfare, not because of bravery or bloodlines, but because of something much simpler. The longbow. On one side stood the English, outnumbered, exhausted, and sick. King Henry V had marched his army for weeks across enemy land after a long siege at Harfleur. His men were weak with dysentery. They were mostly foot soldiers, common men, not heavily armored knights. They didn't have much food. They didn't have enough horses, but they had their bows. Thousands of them. These weren't small toy weapons. Each longbow was as tall as the archer himself. It took real strength to pull one back. Many English archers had been trained from childhood, by law even, to use these giant yew-wood bows. Their fingers were thick from it. Their backs were warped slightly from the tension. But their aim was cruel and practiced. The French had a different plan. They were confident. After all, they outnumbered the English, perhaps by 4-1. They had glittering ranks of mounted knights, rows of armored men-at-arms, and the full pride of France on their side. They believed this would be simple. A crushing blow to a tired English army. A day of honor and glory. But the rain had done something no one expected. The battlefield, a narrow strip between two wooded areas, had turned to slop. The freshly plowed earth, wet from the storm, clung to boots and hooves like glue. Horses sank. Men stumbled. It was a trap, not a battlefield. Henry V knew it. At first light, he made his move. He placed his archers on either side of his line and drove long, sharpened wooden stakes into the ground in front of them. These weren't fancy, just simple, angled poles to stop a horse from charging. He ordered his men to wait, calmly, silently. And then the French attacked, or at least they tried to. It started with a slow advance. Knights on foot first, packed shoulder to shoulder, trudging forward in armor that became heavier with every step through the mud. Behind them came cavalry, trying to keep their footing in the muck. The air was thick, no breeze, just the squish and clank of progress. Then, from the English side, a whistle, and the sky changed. Thousands of arrows, launched all at once, fell like dark rain. Each one was as long as a man's arm, tipped with iron, designed to pierce chainmail and crack helmets. They didn't fly in straight lines. They arced, rising high into the air, disappearing for a moment, then plunging down like jagged birds. The sound was sharp. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The French line shuddered. Men fell, horses screamed, but they kept coming, slipping and staggering forward, only to be met with another volley, and another, and another. The longbowmen were fast, trained to shoot 10, even 12 arrows a minute. Multiply that by thousands, and the field turned into a forest of falling shafts. There was no shelter, no way to hide, and the closer the French got, the more brutal it became. Eventually, the French knights reached the English line, but by then, they were no longer a formation. They were a confused crush of bodies, too close together to swing their swords. The mud was knee-deep. Some men simply fell and could not rise again, trampled, drowned, suffocated in their own armor. And the archers? When the arrows ran low, they didn't run. They drew knives, hatchets, mallets. They joined the fight, lightly armored, fast and angry. They swarmed the edges of the French line, cutting down men who couldn't even lift their swords. Somewhere in that chaos, King Henry himself joined the fray, not behind the lines, but up front, fighting with his men, his crown welded into his helmet. It was messy, not noble, not chivalrous, but it worked. The battle didn't last long. By midday, the field was quiet again. Just the groans of the wounded, the caw of distant crows, and the soft, sucking sound of the mud. The French were broken, thousands dead, many nobles captured, some executed. And the English? Fewer than 500 losses. Agincourt would become legend. Poets would sing about it. Shakespeare would turn it into drama. Kings would claim it as a symbol of English greatness. But on the day itself, it was just tired men, holding bows with sore arms and muddy faces, too hungry to cheer. They sat down quietly in the damp fields. The rain started again. Not one of them would have said they felt victorious, just relieved, and very, very cold. The stone walls don't speak, but they watch. Thick and cold, they've stood for decades, maybe centuries, covered in lichen and soot, shaped by the hands of masons who are long gone. These are no ordinary walls. They are a message, carved in limestone and granite. Come no closer. Yet someone always does. Castles were not just homes. They were hard-shelled warnings. They guarded trade routes, marked territory, protected noble egos. And inside those walls, people, soldiers, cooks, stable hands, board knights, a few chickens, someone named Hugh who fixed the gate, and sometimes, if luck had fled, everyone huddled in fear because a siege had begun. Now, a siege was not the chaotic explosion of action Hollywood sometimes imagines. There were no flaming boulders soaring through the sky every 5 minutes, no battering rams pounding all night. What a real medieval siege was waiting. And math. A lord would arrive outside the walls with his army, unpack his tents, and take a long, thoughtful look at the fortress in front of him. He didn't need to charge it. Not yet. He just needed time. The castle had food, but not forever. The people inside had water, but not always. And the mood inside? That shifted faster than the weather. The most feared weapon in a siege wasn't made of wood or steel. It was boredom. But let's not rush. There were siege engines, machines with names like mangonel, trebuchet, and ballista. These were not elegant tools. They were lumbering creatures of rope, rock, and furious energy, built from felled trees, animal hide, and iron bolts. They were assembled by sweaty engineers with calloused hands and deep frowns. The trebuchet was the most impressive, an enormous counterweight catapult that used physics to lob stones as heavy as oxen across open fields. It did not fire quickly, sometimes just a few shots per day. But when it landed, the ground shook, walls cracked. Morale inside the castle crumbled faster than the masonry. You'd think defenders would be terrified of such machines. And yes, they were. But more often, they were annoyed. You couldn't exactly move a castle out of the way, but you could patch the damage and return fire. Castle walls were thick, sometimes over 10 feet wide, layered with rubble and lime mortar. Hitting them with stones was like trying to dig a well with a dinner spoon. Eventually, you'd get through, but you'd be very tired. There were other methods, too. Tunnels sappers would dig beneath the wall's foundation, set fire to wooden supports, and wait for the weight of the castle to betray itself. Some succeeded. Some were caught. Some forgot to dig in a straight line and popped up in the moat. Medieval engineering, after all, was a mix of math and prayer. Siege towers were another option. Massive wooden buildings on wheels, built as tall as the walls themselves. Rolled forward under cover of shields and smoke, these towers let soldiers climb right over the battlements. Of course, they were also giant fire hazards. One well-aimed torch, and the entire structure might vanish in flames before it reached the gates. The defenders knew this and stocked their walls with oil, pitch, and archers with steady hands. But here's the truth. Most sieges didn't end with the walls falling. They ended quietly, slowly, with rats fattening on crumbs in the storage room while soldiers sharpened their swords for battles that never came. Because a siege wasn't about breaking stone. It was about breaking people. Food ran low. Water spoiled. Illness crept in. People began to whisper. The guards at the gate grew pale. The blacksmith's forge went cold. And somewhere, deep in the Lord's chamber, a decision was made. Surrender. Open the gates. Bargain for mercy. Anything to end the silence. The men outside, they waited, built latrines, played dice, watched for movement on the walls. If they were lucky, the siege lasted a few weeks. If unlucky, it dragged on for months. Winters were brutal. Rain turned camps into mud pits. Supplies ran low. Morale sagged like a torn banner. But if the attacker had patience and a well-stocked wagon train, they usually won. Not all castles fell this way. Some did see fire. Some saw betrayal. Secret doors opened by terrified servants. Gatekeepers bribed. Drawbridges lowered in the night. There are even stories of soldiers sneaking in dressed as monks or merchants. The walls were strong, but people could be persuaded. What most don't realize is how rare a full assault really was. Charging a wall meant losing men, lots of them. And in an age without antibiotics, wounds often killed more than arrows. No commander wanted to explain to a king why half his army now rotted outside a castle he still hadn't taken. So instead, they circled the walls, cut off supplies, waited and waited. Inside the castle, every day stretched longer than the last. Children cried, animals were slaughtered, horses were eaten, candlelight grew dimmer, hope was rationed like bread, and then, one morning, a white flag appeared. The gates opened. Not always. Some castles held out. Some never surrendered. But most did. Because stone, no matter how thick, cannot feed you. And that's what made siege warfare so different from the fast charges and sword fights of legends. It was slow, cold, muffled, and deeply human. So the next time you picture a siege, don't imagine fireballs arcing over battlements. Imagine a gray morning, a line of soldiers standing still, a pot of thin soup boiling inside the walls, a knight watching the horizon with eyes that haven't slept, a messenger riding out with a scroll in hand, and a trebuchet creaking gently in the mist, waiting for one more shot. Not to destroy, but to remind the castle it was only a matter of time. The war did not begin with a bang. It began with a claim. You are standing in a cold English hall, sometime in the early 1300s. The hearth is crackling. A nobleman leans over a carved oak table, staring at a map of France. His voice is measured, patient, but underneath it, you hear ambition. His name is Edward III, and he believes quite firmly that he should be King of France. But France already has a king. So begins the war with a name far too neat for what actually happened. The 100 Years' War did not last 100 years. It lasted 116, from 1337 to 1453, and it was not a single continuous struggle. There were long pauses, decades sometimes where not a sword was raised. Soldiers grew old and died waiting for the next campaign. Kings changed, languages evolved, but the reasons stayed. At its heart, this war was about who ruled what, and whether land across the Channel belonged to the English crown or the French. Because for centuries, English kings had controlled bits of France, duchies, fiefs, towns, ports, pieces left behind from when the Normans crossed the sea and conquered England in 1066. France wanted those pieces back. England, naturally, wanted to keep them. And so, they argued, with arrows, knights, and fire. But it wasn't a war the way you might imagine it. Most years, nothing happened. Just rumors, marches, and talks. Then, suddenly, a siege, or a skirmish. A treaty, maybe, then back to nothing. And that, really, is the strange rhythm of the 100 Years' War. Not chaos, but intermittent bursts of very organized violence. The first notable moment comes in 1346, at the Battle of Crécy. Imagine a wide field, somewhere in northern France. The sky is gray. The English have planted themselves on a hill. Their archers line the flanks, longbows at the ready. The French cavalry charges, shining and loud. But the mud is deep. The slope is steep. The arrows are fast. And before long, the battlefield is choked with armored knights, not galloping, but slipping, falling, and dying. That's the first time the English longbow really makes its mark. It's not just a weapon, it becomes a symbol, a reason the underdog keeps winning. A few years later, it happens again. Poitiers, 1356. The English strike hard and capture the French king. Imagine the shock. A whole country without its monarch. Taxes halt, orders freeze. The French crown ransoms its own king for a sum so huge that the economy bends under it. You might think this would end the war. It didn't. Because the next king, or the next one, always had something to prove. So, time passed. Towns changed sides. Peasants suffered. And nothing ever stayed settled for long. One of the strangest things about this war is how often it stopped. For plague, for cold, for boredom. Armies would gather, wait for battle, and then disperse without fighting. The commanders would write angry letters. The scribes would record it as a campaign. But really, it was just a very expensive camping trip. There were truces, treaties, and half-hearted peace talks. But the question, who should rule France, was never answered to anyone's satisfaction. It was too tangled. The war had become a habit, a background hum of conflict, always just behind the next hill. And then came Agincourt, in 1415. This time, the English king is Henry V, young, determined, and far too clever. He lands with a small army, marches through enemy territory, and finds himself outnumbered. Rain has turned the fields into slush. The French, again, charge with cavalry. And again, the longbows speak. It is a disaster for France. Thousands of nobles fall. Entire generations of families vanish in a single afternoon. Henry becomes a legend. The war, now 40 years old, suddenly feels fresh again. For a while, it seems like the English might actually win. Paris changes hands. Treaties are signed. Henry marries the French king's daughter. Their child, it's agreed, will inherit both kingdoms. But then Henry dies young, and everything unravels. Now, the French begin to push back, and here enters Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl. No title, no training, just voices in her head that tell her to drive out the English. She wears armor. She leads troops. She breaks the siege of Orléans. And though she is captured, tried, and burned, her effect is enormous. Morale lifts. French armies win. The tide turns. By 1453, the English hold only one small port, Calais. Everything else is gone. No treaty ends the war. It just stops. The English, exhausted, go home. The French, battered, rebuild. And the war's long shadow stretches forward into legend. So what did it all mean? Not much land was gained or lost. The map changed, but not as much as the people did. Entire towns vanished. Languages evolved. National identities hardened. England and France, once intertwined, began to see themselves as truly separate. And war itself began to change. Knights, once proud and central, were replaced by infantry and gunpowder. Castles fell faster. Monarchs needed standing armies. not just feudal levies. The 100 Years' War, though chaotic, pushed medieval warfare toward something modern. Still, when you picture it now, it's not one war. It's a slow, winding series of episodes. Muddy fields, broken sieges, long waits, cold winters, heavy armor, brave messengers, forgotten treaties. It was not glorious. It was not clean. It was long. And yet, there's something almost peaceful about how it drifted from memory, like a storm that took a century to pass, only to leave behind stories told by firelight in quiet halls. The sun rises slowly over the damp fields of Essex. It's early June, 1381. There's no fanfare, no polished armor clinking down the road. Just farmers, bakers, blacksmiths, and shepherds, ordinary people who have finally had enough. You hear it in the low murmur of the crowd, voices cracking with sleep, anger, and something close to hope. Someone is holding a pitchfork. Another man carries a staff. One boy has tied a broken bit of chain around his waist, like a belt. None of them look like soldiers. But they are walking toward London. The road is dusty and uneven. A few chickens cluck nervously as the group passes. There are no banners, no drums, no noble titles. Just one name, whispered again and again. Wat Tyler. A Tyler by trade. A nobody, really. Until this week. They say the revolt began in Kent. Others swear it was Essex. It hardly matters now. What matters is what started it. Poll tax. A strange little thing, really. Every adult pays the same amount, whether you're rich or poor. A shilling here. A groat there. But it adds up, especially when the king keeps demanding more. You see, England had just finished another round of war with France. The 100 Years' War was a long and expensive business, and King Richard II, just a boy of 14, needed money. His advisors needed even more. So, the crown did what kings often did when they were short on gold. They reached deep into the pockets of the poor. This time, though, the poor reached back. A tax collector arrived in a small village, asking questions he shouldn't, demanding money he couldn't explain. In one story, he tries to strip search a peasant's daughter to prove her age. That was the last straw. The villagers beat him and sent him packing. Word spread like fire across dry fields, and the people, tired of taxes, hunger, and the arrogance of those who wore velvet, rose up. Not with war horses or lords in gleaming mail, but with kitchen knives, cudgels, and anger that had been boiling for years. Wat Tyler becomes their leader, though no one quite remembers how. He's clear when he speaks, steady when he walks. He doesn't shout, doesn't promise gold or miracles. Just fairness, justice, a world where no man must bow because of the family he was born into. By mid-June, the crowds grow thick as summer flies. They tear through the countryside, not looting at first, but burning court records, tax rolls, legal documents that define who owns what, and who owes whom. These papers are not sacred to the peasants. They are chains. They reach London like a tide. Thousands of them. Some say 30,000, others more. The city gates open, not because the lords welcome them, but because the city's own poor are tired too. They pour into the capital. They find the grand houses of the king's ministers. They set them alight. They find the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, one of the men behind the hated poll tax, and drag him from the Tower of London. His head rolls in Tower Hill soon after. So does the king's treasurer. No noble army stops them. No knights appear with shining swords. For a brief and terrifying moment, the crown is at the mercy of the people. But then comes the meeting. Young King Richard II, just 14, agrees to meet Wat Tyler and the rebels at Smithfield, just outside the city. It is a warm June day, the kind of day where birds sing, and you wonder if the wind itself is holding its breath. Wat Tyler rides forward to speak. He wears a sword, but he doesn't draw it. He stands before the boy king and calmly demands freedom for every man. No more serfdom, no more landlords, no more unpaid labor to some distant earl with a soft voice and heavy rings. The king seems to agree, smiles, nods, offers charters of freedom. The people cheer. It could have ended there, but it doesn't. In the moments after the cheers, something happens. Some say Wat Tyler turns his back. Others say a royal knight insults him. Maybe he spits. Maybe he reaches for his dagger. It's never clear. What is clear is that William Walworth, the mayor of London, pulls a blade and stabs Wat Tyler in the stomach. Another royal man finishes the job. Wat dies in the dirt, steps from a boy king and his promise of justice. The crowd panics. But Richard, oddly calm, steps forward and declares, "I am your captain now." And for a moment, the people believe him. They follow him back into the city. They accept his charters of freedom. They begin to leave, walking back to their fields and homes, clutching hope like a fragile bird in their palms. But within days, the charters are revoked. The promises are declared null. The king's soldiers ride out. Rebels are hunted. Hundreds are arrested. Dozens are hanged. Many more are beheaded in public squares. Wat Tyler's head is placed on a pike and mounted on London Bridge, where crows and kings can see it alike. And just like that, the great peasants' revolt fades, not in glory, not in triumph, but in cold retribution and quiet forgetting. Still, something lingers. The peasants don't win, not really. Serfdom isn't abolished overnight, but it starts to die. Slowly, lords begin to pay wages. Villages negotiate rents. The idea that a peasant could speak to a king, even for a moment, does not vanish. It echoes. It seeds something. It stirs the soil. And though Wat Tyler never lived to see it, the world begins to change. So tonight, as you rest under your blanket and the hum of sleep drifts near, picture the road out of London, dirt beneath your boots, smoke in the distance, and the soft memory of a man who once rode to meet a king, not with an army, but with a question. Why must some be born to kneel? And for a moment, the king listened. It begins not with swords drawn, but with parchment unrolled. A pope sits in a heavy chair, far from the Holy Land, beneath the cool stone arches of a Roman basilica. He is not young, neither are the men around him. The first crusade had been a century earlier. The glory days, they thought, were behind them. But still, the Holy Sepulchre was not in Christian hands. Jerusalem remained distant, unreachable, sacred. So, he writes, in 1213, Pope Innocent III sends out a letter. Call it a divine invitation. Call it a heavenly guilt trip. Another crusade, he declares. One last, pure effort. Not led by kings this time. No baggage, no politics. Just knights and pilgrims marching under God's banner. The Fourth Crusade had ended in disaster. The Christian armies sacked Constantinople, a Christian city. They stole relics, gold, marble. The East was furious. The church split. Now Innocent wants to fix things. He wants a real crusade, one that behaves. But what he gets is different. They call it the Fifth Crusade. It's planned slowly, carefully, and like many grand plans in the Middle Ages, it begins to fall apart the moment boots touch the dirt. Picture it. 1217. Europe is restless again. Small groups of knights trickle toward the Mediterranean, some from Hungary, some from Austria. Even the Emperor of Germany promises support, but his help will come later. For now, it's mostly second sons, minor lords, and men with more zeal than strategy. They gather in Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold in the Levant. The old Crusader states have shrunk. Jerusalem is lost. The Holy Orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, are still there, maintaining their castles, guarding pilgrims, holding the line. But the Golden Age is over. Still, they welcome the new Crusaders with open arms and quiet doubt. What's the plan? Egypt. They've decided, this time, not to march through Syria or the desert. They'll go south. The logic is simple. Egypt, after all, is the beating heart of the Muslim world. Rich, powerful, full of grain and trade. If they take Egypt, the Crusaders believe, then Jerusalem will follow. Cut off the head, and the body will collapse. So they sail. In 1218, the Crusaders arrive at Damietta, a port city on the Nile Delta. Palm trees sway. Mosques rise beyond the mud brick walls. The city is defended, but not impossibly so. The Crusaders begin the siege. And the waiting begins. Sieges in the Middle Ages are never quick. This one drags on for over a year. The Nile floods. The Crusaders sink in mud. Their horses suffer. The weather flips between baking sun and sudden rain. Disease creeps through the camp. Supplies run short. Tempers flare. Still, they hold the line. Then, in 1219, they get lucky. Reinforcements arrive. A strange figure appears, Francis of Assisi, the barefoot monk who will one day become a saint. He tries to speak with the Sultan. He walks calmly through the lines, crosses no man's land, and offers peace, or conversion, or something gentler than what steel can provide. The Sultan listens politely, then sends him home. Eventually, the Crusaders break through. Damietta falls. They march through the gates. But here's where the story changes again. Instead of triumph, they find indecision. The leaders argue. Some want to hold the city. Others want to press on to Cairo. But the Nile is a trickster. Its channels wind unpredictably. Its floods are merciless. Local guides vanish. The army gets lost in a marsh. Then, in 1221, the Sultan counterattacks. The Crusaders are trapped. Their supply lines are cut. They try to retreat. The Nile swells again. Horses drown. Wagons tip. Panic spreads. There is no glorious last stand, just exhaustion, heat, mud, surrender. They give up Damietta, march back to the coast, and sail home. Back in Europe, the news spreads slowly. Another crusade, lost. Another attempt, wasted. The Pope is dead by then. Innocent III passed away in 1216. His vision never came true. And the Crusaders? Most return with nothing but blisters and regret. There is something quietly human about this story. It wasn't a war of conquest, not in the usual way. It was a war of belief. And like many medieval wars, it began with hope, then sagged under the weight of reality. Logistics failed, weather ruined plans, Miscommunication fractured alliances. The enemy was clever, the land was unfamiliar, and perhaps God was silent. And yet, it wasn't the end. There would be more crusades after this. Children would march. Emperors would try again. But by the time of the Fifth Crusade, the world was already changing. The idea of marching thousands of miles to claim a holy site was beginning to wear thin. The unity of Christendom was fraying. The Eastern Roman Empire had been badly weakened. Islam was not collapsing. It was organizing. New dynasties were rising. Trade was becoming more valuable than conquest. So why do we remember this one? Because it tried to be different. It tried to learn from past mistakes. It tried to be cleaner, holier, more focused. And instead, it stumbled in the same old mud. It showed that even with careful planning and noble goals, medieval warfare often ended in confusion, suffering, and retreat. Tonight, as you rest beneath your blankets, think of that quiet monk walking between armies. Think of the knights slogging through the flooded delta. Think of those who fought not for glory, but because a letter arrived telling them they should. They didn't know how it would end. They never do. In the early morning light of May 29th, 1453, the last breaths of the Eastern Roman Empire float quietly over Constantinople's ancient stone walls. The city has seen many sieges before. Sieges by Persians, Arabs, Crusaders. And yet, something feels different now. This time they have a cannon. But let's start just a little before that. The city of Constantinople had been standing for over 1,000 years. Its walls were thick and high, layers of stone and brick that had protected it since Roman times. Emperors had lived behind them. Saints were buried within them. Inside, golden icons gleamed in candlelight, and chants rose softly from marble churches. The people believed their city was protected, not just by the stones, but by heaven. Outside those walls, though, a new world was waking up. A young sultan named Mehmed II sits in a tent just out of sight of the city's towers. He is only 21, but he's not playing games. He's studied the old failures. He knows you don't take Constantinople by waiting. You take it by force, and you do it loudly. And that's where the cannon comes in. It's not just a cannon, it's the cannon. Built by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, it's longer than a wagon, wider than a tree stump. It takes 60 oxen to move it, and when it fires, the earth shakes. They call it the Basilica, a name that sounds more like a church than a weapon, which feels about right for something that changes the world. The cannon fires just a few times each day, because it takes hours to reload. But every blast hits the city's once invincible walls with brutal purpose. The stones crack. The defenders scramble. For the first time in 1,000 years, it seems like the walls might actually fall. The siege lasts for 53 days. Inside the city, the emperor, Constantine XI, doesn't have much left. His army is small. His allies are scattered. Rome sends promises, but few ships. The Venetians and Genoese argue over trade and timing. The Byzantine Empire is down to just this one city. But still, the people resist. They pray. They repair what they can. They hope. At night, the torches flicker. Smoke from cannon fire drifts like ghosts across the battlements. Inside the Hagia Sophia, the great domed church, priests light incense and sing the same hymns they've sung for centuries. They know what's coming, but they sing anyway. And then, on the final day, Mehmed launches the full assault. The cannon has done its work. The wall is weak. The Ottomans charge. Waves of soldiers slam against the breach. The defenders fight back, but they're outnumbered 10-1. Arrows whistle. Ladders crash. For a moment, the tide holds. And then, it breaks. A small gate, left open by mistake, lets Ottoman troops inside. Once they're through, it unravels quickly. The emperor, dressed in armor with no royal insignia, throws himself into the fray and disappears. His body is never found. By midday, the city falls. And just like that, a chapter of history ends. The Roman Empire, by then reduced to one city, is gone. The Middle Ages don't end with a trumpet or a treaty. They end with gunpowder and a hole in a wall. But this isn't just the end of Constantinople. It's the beginning of something new. You see, the cannon didn't just take down walls. It took down ideas. For centuries, castles had been safe havens, thick towers and fortified keeps built to keep out the chaos. But now a clever engineer and enough gunpowder could bring them down in a week. The age of knights and sieges was fading. Walls were no longer the final answer. Architects would start to design differently. Forts became lower, thicker, angled, less like fairy tale castles and more like puzzles of stone meant to absorb impact. War became less personal, more mechanical, and slower. But let's not race ahead. Let's stay here, just a moment longer. In the quiet after the battle, Mehmed walks through the city. He steps into the Hagia Sophia, now silent. He orders it spared, converted into a mosque, yes, but not destroyed. He is young, ambitious, but not careless. He sees Constantinople not just as a victory, but as a future. He renames it Istanbul. He makes it his capital. The crossroads of East and West now belongs to him. And what of the people? Some flee, others stay. The city, for all its wounds, breathes again. Different prayers echo in the same chambers. The walls are repaired. Life resumes. Not the same life, but life all the same. And so, what started as a siege becomes a turning point. A shift from one age to another. It's not loud once the cannon goes quiet. It's a long, slow change, like the fading of stars before dawn. But the world doesn't quite go back to how it was before. As you drift off tonight, think about that cannon. Huge, clumsy, deafening. It didn't just break a wall. It broke an idea that anything, no matter how ancient, how sacred, how well defended, could truly last forever. And yet, in the cracks of that fallen wall, something else took root. A city survived. A world changed. Thanks for listening. If you're already asleep, great. We've successfully lulled you to sleep. And if you're still awake, well, that's impressive. If you genuinely enjoy these boring stories about history, feel free to subscribe to our channel whenever you're in the mood. Sleep well, and good night.